Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different. This one is called I Crashed Into a UFO. Yes, you heard correctly. These are about cases in which people have had actual collisions with an unidentified flying object or an actual extraterrestrial. I didn't expect to find as many cases as I actually did. I found cases involving planes, trains, automobiles, and boats. Mostly planes and automobiles. I found about a dozen cases in which UFOs and planes have collided, even more involving automobiles. I found only one case involving a train and one case involving a boat. I suspect there are more of all of these cases, but statistically speaking, these are quite rare, very unusual encounters, and it's really quite interesting what happens when someone collides directly into a UFO or extraterrestrial. So let's just get started. I'm breaking this down into the various categories of planes, trains, automobiles, and boats. I'm going to start with planes, then move to automobiles, and then cover the only cases I have involving one with a train and one with a ocean-going vessel, a boat. So, starting with planes. The earliest case that I could find involving a plane colliding into a UFO occurred in July of 1951 over Atlanta, Georgia. This occurred to a gentleman by the name of Fred Reagan, who was cruising at 8,000 feet in his Piper Cub when he says a brilliantly lit lozenge-shaped object collided with his plane, tearing off the tail. Now this case comes from Gordon Creighton, who was the editor of the Flying Saucer Review, and he wrote a report on this. And according to Gordon Creighton, the pilot, Fred Reagan, says that he was thrown clear of the wreckage and found himself in free fall. Moments later, he was pulled into a dark chamber and realized that he was inside the UFO, apparently, which had struck his plane, and surrounding him were several 3-foot-tall shiny figures with the appearance of, get this, huge stalks of metallic asparagus. That's quite unusual. I've never heard a case like that. Fred Reagan fainted, he says, and when he woke up, he found himself lying on a table, and these figures apologized for striking his plane. They spoke in English. They said, "We are here only to observe your primitive civilization." They also told him, "We have corrected an abnormality in your body called cancer. We offer this as a slight reparation for the loss we have caused you." So this is one of the earliest cases of a UFO healing. Now, Fred Reagan, again, fainted at this point, and when he regained consciousness, he found himself in a hospital. And he was told by the personnel there that he had been found next to the wreckage of his plane and was apparently uninjured. So the end note to this case came 1 year later with a press release which said, and I quote, "Fred Reagan, who made headlines last year when he had been a visitor aboard a flying saucer, died today in the state asylum for the insane. Cause of death was determined to be degeneration of the brain tissue due to extreme atomic radiation. Authorities are unable to offer an explanation." So Gordon Creighton published this report in the 1969 issue of Flying Saucer Review, but the report was actually first uncovered by Flying Saucer Review editor Derek Dempster back in 1951, but was not published at that time due to its fantastic nature. Gordon Creighton tried to verify this report. However, as he says, "Despite years of trying, I have failed to find anyone who can or will throw any light upon the story for me or authenticate it. It may be untrue, but I do not think that it is. It contains far too many elements which in this summer of 1969 seemed to me to possess the ring of truth, but which very understandably may not have seemed to possess it in 1951. So yeah, the case remains controversial. Other investigators have tried to verify it and have been unsuccessful or even unable to identify the witness, Fred Reagan. And a few of them have gone on record with their belief that this case is not true. However, Gordon Creighton still stands by it, and despite his own misgivings, he writes, "We have heard too much since 1951 to be able to simply dismiss it out of hand." So yeah, a controversial case, but it's certainly not the only one. For example, this next case, which occurred only 4 years later, on July 22nd, 1955, over Pixley, this is outside of Bakersfield, California. This case is pretty well verified. The main witness was an Air Force major by the name of Mervin Stevens. He was reportedly flying at 16,000 feet over Pixley, and he told reporters that at 11 a.m. on July 22nd, 1955, the engine of his C-131D aircraft suddenly staggered, and the entire plane was knocked to the right by a terrific blow. He said, and I quote, "It was as if we struck a brick wall." At this point, the plane went into an immediate, uncontrolled vertical dive, and both Major Stevens, the pilot, and his co-pilot, Charles Everett Stamper, actually blacked out from the severe gravitational forces. Incredibly and fortunately, Stevens regained consciousness and managed to recover control of the aircraft. He immediately radioed to Bakersfield Airport that he had been, quote, "struck by a flying saucer." He requested and of course received clearance for an emergency landing. The plane landed with only one injured crewman, the co-pilot, Airman First Class Charles Stamper, who was taken to Kern County Medical Hospital and was then hospitalized at Hamilton Air Force Base. He had injuries to his face and knee. However, an examination of the plane revealed that it was severely damaged. The left elevator control surface was, quote, "gone or smashed." The plane's tail section was reportedly shattered. So the Air Force was very interested in this, and in fact, a team from Edwards Air Force Base was dispatched to the scene to study the damage, and an Air Force spokesman later told reporters that the plane, quote, "looked like something struck from above." Now later, Major Stevens was in fact silenced by his superiors, and he refused to discuss the incident any further with reporters. And the official Air Force explanation came when Captain Smith of Edwards Air Force Base Information announced that the cause of the accident was mechanical malfunction. However, in support of the UFO explanation for this incident is the fact that several residents in the area also reported seeing UFOs at the time of the accident. And in fact, reports came in from San Joaquin Valley and from Fresno, both neighboring areas. One of the witnesses was Miss Ray Brown of Fresno, and she reported that at 5:30 a.m. that morning, she observed a glowing green, quote, egg-shaped object. Further confirmation came from two other witnesses, Mr. and Mrs. Kenneth McMullins of Pixley, who said that they also observed an unknown object in the sky on that day. All of these witnesses reported their sightings only after hearing about this mysterious airplane crash. So definitely quite interesting. Another case comes from John Keel. He's quite well known in this field. And that occurred in the same year, 1955, only a few months later. This was in October of 1955 when a pilot was in his B-47 over Lovington, New Mexico, when he says something collided with his plane. And there was only one survivor to this accident who said that the plane struck some unknown solid aerial object. So it wasn't verified exactly what this was, but again, there were ground witnesses. Another witness on the ground said that he saw, quote, a ball of fire which appeared near the plane just before the accident. So again, pretty good confirmation. And here's yet another case, 2 years later. This one was uncovered by UFO researcher Anton Anfilov, who says that on July 18, 1957, a USAF fighter was flying between Clovis and Portales, New Mexico, when his plane was struck by a 30-foot wide gray-colored craft. Both the plane and apparently the UFO tumbled to the ground. The pilot did not survive. The UFO occupants were described as Nordics, and they were apparently also killed by an intense fire on board the craft, though the craft itself still remained largely intact. This craft was allegedly dismantled and shipped to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and then later moved to Area 51. Again, this all comes from researcher Anton Anfilov, and according to his source, the UFO struck the plane because it had been struck and disabled by a missile launched from nearby Cannon Air Force Base, and he says was one of the first UFOs to be successfully downed by the U.S. military. And he says that currently the craft is now being stored at an underground facility in White Sands, New Mexico. Now again, this case is coming from a third-hand source. It's not well verified, but what's very interesting is that there were a huge rash of sightings on the days around this incident. In fact, the day prior, on July 17, an Air Force plane, RB-47 aircraft, was followed for more than 700 miles for over an hour all the way from Mississippi to Oklahoma. And that's just one of several cases in that area at that time. So I think that does lend some credence to this account, but you can make up your own minds about it. And if you don't believe it, there's always another case coming along. And in fact, one occurred just a few years later. This next one occurred on April 1st, 1959 at 6:30 p.m. when an Air Force C-118 cargo plane took off from McChord Air Force Base outside of Tacoma, Washington. This plane had been flying southward for about 90 minutes and was near Orting and Tenino, Washington, when an apparent collision occurred, causing the plane to catch fire and plummet to the ground. Researcher Bob Gribble, the founder of NUFORC, the National UFO Reporting Center, investigated the incident in depth. He says he actually tried to approach the scene of the accident itself, but was turned away by military personnel and the police. He was, however, able to interview 2 eyewitnesses who told him that at the time of the crash, they saw a, quote, UFO flying north, the opposite direction of the C-118. Now, I will say an official investigation of the incident concluded that the plane had caught fire and that the people who believed they saw a UFO were actually seeing the stricken aircraft. However, Bob Gribble learned that the pilot, a gentleman by the name of Robert L. Dimmick, had actually called in a Mayday distress call saying, quote, "We've hit something, or something has hit us." And shortly before the aircraft hit the ground, a final message came from the pilot saying only, "This is it." So Bob Gribble talked to people who had been at the crash site and actually viewed the wreckage, and they told him that the plane was smashed to tiny bits and was shredded almost beyond belief. Gribble also received information that radar stations at McCord Air Force Base had been tracking UFOs immediately prior to the incident, although when he talked to the public information officer at the base, he refused to either confirm or deny this report. So there were many other details that raised questions about this incident, such as what appeared to be a clampdown and cover-up of any information about the crash. It's quite an interesting case, and there are many others. One of the most interesting cases of this kind, and quite dramatic, occurred over Mexico City on May 2nd, 1974. The main witness in this case is private pilot Carlos de los Santos Montiel. He was flying en route from Guerrero State to Mexico City in his Piper Aztec 24. Without warning, 3 objects appeared in close formation surrounding his plane. Now, these objects were not huge. He says they were about 10 feet or so in diameter. They approached his plane. 2 flew just below the tips of the wings, and the third was directly in front and below his plane. He heard and felt a noise, and felt one of these craft actually scrape the under part of his plane, causing his plane to jolt. At this moment, he realized that the aircraft and landing gear were frozen. He was terrified and weeping. He radioed the airport control tower at Mexico City, and after calling on the radio, the objects darted off. Montiel made a safe landing. His plane was apparently undamaged. However, Montiel was quite shook up, quite traumatized. He was examined and found to be healthy, though he was, again, quite shaken up. He wondered if perhaps these craft had come and surrounded his plane, which was quite old, in an attempt to keep it aloft. That's pure speculation, he says, but it's absolutely a well-verified case. It got a lot of publicity. People continue to talk about it today. It's one of the more dramatic cases in which UFOs have actually shown up and collided with a plane. This was more of a fender bender, but definitely it made contact with this Piper Aztec. And here's another case, which was reported by Canadian researcher Chris Rutkowski. This occurred in June of 1974. A Japanese Air Force pilot was flying an F-4 Phantom jet at 30,000 feet when an unknown object began to approach at very high speed. Now, the pilot and weapons officer on board the plane assumed that at first this was a Soviet aircraft, and they immediately engaged their onboard weapons to lock onto the object. But instead, as the object came into visual range, they saw that it was a metallic disc, 40 feet wide, with squarish openings along the side. As they locked on the weapons system, the UFO increased its speed and, according to the report, headed directly for the plane, striking it directly on the nose. The 2 crew members immediately ejected. While the pilot survived, the weapons officer did not. The Japanese government, according to Rutkowski, did not deny the incident, but refused to acknowledge the presence of the UFO, saying only that the accident was, quote, caused by a collision with an unknown object at 30,000 feet. So again, these cases don't have a lot of information, some of them, and they're quite controversial, but there's so many of them. And here's another one. This one occurred on August 25, 1974, and this one became quite famous because apparently the plane and the UFO itself crashed to the ground. This was investigated by researchers No Torres and Ruben Uriarte, and they published the results of their investigation in their book, Mexico's Roswell. So again, August 25, 1974, It was 10:07 p.m., and according to Torres and Uriarty, officials at the U.S. Air Defense Radar Station tracked an unknown controlled object moving at about 2,000 miles per hour. It was changing course and slowed down over the town of Coyame. This is about 40 miles south of the U.S. border, where it mysteriously disappeared from their radar scopes. At this time, the plane from El Paso was apparently struck by the object, and both the plane and the UFO plummeted to the earth. This collision was reportedly witnessed by local residents, and when morning arrived, many of the residents of the town of Coyame were surprised to see soldiers from the Mexican army in town. They roped off the scene and recovered both the plane and the disc-like craft. Meanwhile, U.S. authorities were reportedly monitoring the recovery from the aircraft overhead. At some point during the recovery, U.S. authorities noticed that the trucks carrying the UFO and the plane had stopped, and they were shocked to see that all the Mexican soldiers who were transporting this craft had apparently died. The speculation is that they died of some unknown biological contamination or agent, but according to Torres and Uriarty, U.S. authorities scooped up the UFO with a helicopter and carried it back to the U.S. and destroyed all the remaining evidence, and for the next 25 years, the incident was covered up. A very controversial case, but there's quite a bit of information about it. Another controversial case, which has never been fully explained, occurred over Mobile, Alabama on October 23, 1992. The main witness in this case is a gentleman by the name of Thomas J. Preziosi, and he was killed when his Cessna cargo plane crashed into a marsh. His flight had only been aloft for 10 minutes when it went down. NTSB investigators converged on the crash scene, and the wreckage showed that the plane had apparently collided into something at about 3,000 feet elevation. The plane was shattered in such a manner that it was clear to investigators there had been a head-on collision. Now, there were some unidentified, quote, red streaks, which researchers were unable to account for, other than that they did not come from the pilot's plane. The first suspect, of course, was another plane. However, there were no other flights in the area except a DC-10, which was flying at 4,000 feet, and it had no accident and showed no damage. They speculated on the possibility of an uncatalogued drug plane, but rejected that as an analysis of the crash site showed only wreckage from one plane. It was also considered the possibility of drones, unmanned aerial vehicles, but this was rejected when Air Force officials from nearby Tyndall Air Force Base and Eglin Air Force Base in Florida denied testing any drones in that area at that time. So NTSB investigators reported their findings and were surprised when their superiors released the cause of the crash as, quote, pilot error. They did not believe that was the case. They protested, and so did the family of the pilot, and the NTSB, as a result, was forced to reopen the case, and this time the cause of the crash was labeled as, quote, collision with an unknown object. And in fact, an NTSB spokesman said, and I quote, I don't know of any other accident that we have in our files that states collision with an unknown object. So whether or not this was with an actual UFO is hard to say, but I think it does deserve a place on this list. However, this next case definitely was a UFO plane collision, and this occurred over Mexico City on July 28, 1994. It's very well verified. In fact, the main witness, Captain Raimundo Cervantes Ruano, has spoken about this publicly. Ruano had logged 17,000 flying hours over a period of 40 years when this accident occurred. And on this evening, July 28, 1994, he experienced an encounter unlike anything he had ever experienced. He was flying flight number 129 at 5,000 feet on its final approach to the Mexico City airport. Captain Ruano had just lowered the landing gear in preparation for a touchdown, and shortly later, he notified flight controller Enrique Colbeck that an unidentified object was ahead of their plane, stationary in the sky. And unable to avoid it, the DC-9 actually collided directly with this UFO. And Captain Ruano believed that the collision with the UFO actually damaged his landing gear, and he declared an emergency. The entire airport was shut down as airport personnel prepared for a possible crash. Thankfully, the plane did land safely. However, an inspection of the landing gear showed that there was a large unexplained gash in the front wheel hydraulics that had apparently been caused by the collision with the UFO. Now, Enrique Colbeck, who was in charge of this flight, later told researchers that he had in fact received earlier calls about UFOs in the area, but that there were no other known aircraft in that area at that time. However, only a few days later, on August 8, 1994, Aeromexico Flight 304 had a near collision with an object described as 60 feet wide, and it came so close to the plane's nose that the co-pilot shouted out to the captain, "Oh my God, we are going to crash." Fortunately, no such collision occurred, but upon landing, the pilots of Flight 304 were told that theirs was the 5th UFO report that week. A very interesting case. And here's another interesting case, and you can actually see the damage done to the plane in this case. This occurred on June 4, 2013, when a Chinese passenger jet took off from Chengdu Airport in China. It began its journey towards Guangzhou. At about 26,000 feet elevation, there was a loud banging sound as the Boeing 757 struck an apparent, quote, foreign object directly on the nose cone of the jet. The pilot radioed Chengdu Airport and requested an emergency landing due to mechanical failure. And although the pilot couldn't see any damage from his vantage point in the cockpit, the jet, he said, was hard to control. Now, what the pilot actually struck remains a mystery. They themselves have remained silent, and this entire incident would probably have gone unnoticed if not for the fact that an inquisitive passenger snapped photos of the damage as he unboarded the plane. And this photo shows a very large indentation on the left side of the nose cone. This dent is a few feet deep, several feet wide. Scratches and scraped paintwork are evident in these photos. And while the pilots failed to go public, an air traffic controller allegedly reported that at the time of the incident, they had 6 unidentified targets on their radar scopes. After this incident, the targets suddenly vanished. So that's pretty good confirmation. I will say that the China Daily News reported that the collision was due to bird strikes. And in fact, there are some species of birds who have been seen flying at that elevation, 26,000 feet. Not many birds can do this. Vultures, condors, geese, and a few others can reach that height, but not normally do they fly at such high altitudes. And a further investigation reportedly ruled out bird strikes due to a, quote, lack of blood, feathers, or any other bird remains. So what struck Air China Flight CA4307? There has been some speculation it was a drone. Others believe it was a UFO. And if you look at other aircraft that have reportedly struck birds, it looks pretty consistent with the damage sustained to this Boeing 757. However, whatever happened remains a mystery. And another very similar incident occurred to another jet, a Boeing 757, in October of 2017. This is quite an interesting case. This flight was en route from Minneapolis, Minnesota to Chicago and was flying at about 30,000 feet during the night when an object suddenly smashed into the nose cone, again leaving a huge dent, which was not discovered until the plane landed. What's interesting about this case is the passengers on the plane included the NBA basketball team, the Oklahoma City Thunder. And in fact, team member Carmelo Anthony actually posted an image of the plane's damage on Twitter, and he wrote on Twitter, "What possibly could we have hit in the sky at this time of night?" Another team member, Patrick Patterson, joked that maybe they had, quote, accidentally hit Superman while flying. So there was a lot of joking around this incident, but it absolutely happened. Delta Airlines reported that there were no injuries and the damage was likely caused by a bird. This created quite a lot of buzz on Twitter. Many disagreed with the bird explanation, but as we have seen, birds do fly at that height. And while birds may have been responsible for the damage on this particular flight, or maybe not, there are other incidents that were clearly not caused by birds. Those are all the cases I've found in which planes have collided with UFOs. And statistically speaking, you'd think there'd be quite a lot more because there are literally thousands of cases in which pilots have seen UFOs, sometimes at quite close proximity to these objects. So I'm going to say that the chances of a plane actually colliding into a UFO are 0.01%. I mean, really low, statistically insignificant. I don't think that there's any real danger, as was stated in the congressional hearings. No, in most cases, UFOs easily fly circles, literally, around our own aircraft. But on these rare occasions, yeah, they do collide. And there are even more cases involving automobiles. These are cases which have taken place all over the world, various types of craft, or sometimes what appears to be smaller probe-like objects. So I'm just going to take you through time and present all these cases, some very interesting cases in which people have collided into UFOs and extraterrestrials, actually, with their automobiles. Now, a collision with a UFO is perhaps the rarest type of UFO encounter. I think that there are more cases of UFO crash retrievals, honestly, than of UFO collisions. But UFO car collision cases are quite numerous. There's more than a dozen cases, well over a dozen cases. The earliest one I could find occurred on the evening of December 28, 1954, near Chippewa Falls in Wisconsin. 3 people were driving down the highway when a glowing red spherical object the size of a basketball zoomed down from above and headed straight for their car. It happened so quickly that the driver was unable to avoid a collision. This object struck the car, first hitting the radio antenna and then the chrome strip above the driver's window, above the side window. The impact produced a loud metallic clanging sound, indicating that this object was in fact metallic. But after striking the vehicle, the glowing object flew off into the darkness, and what exactly struck the car was never identified. Another incident occurred about 11 years later. This was researched by UFO investigator Brad Steiger, and it's quite a harrowing event. This occurred on February 7, 1965, to a salesman who was driving late at night along a highway through a desert in the southwestern United States. I'll call this gentleman Carl, and the incident began when Carl observed a brilliant object which was about 25 feet ahead of him floating above the highway. And this object began to play a cat and mouse game with him for a few minutes and then came directly towards his vehicle, and he felt it was an apparent attempt to force him off the road, which it did. Carl swerved off the road and into a ditch. He jumped out of the car, at which point this object, he says, rammed directly into his vehicle. As Brad Steiger writes, and I quote, "The UFO continued to strike the automobile until it had smashed the car into a tree and wrecked it beyond repair." So following this incident, Carl had the car taken to a junkyard, but shortly later, the owner of the junkyard called him back and said he wanted the car removed from his junkyard immediately. Carl asked why, and the junkyard owner said, "After what happened last night, I refuse to have that car on my lot." Now the junkyard owner wouldn't say why, but Carl suspects that the UFO was probably involved. So yeah, that's a case from Brad Steiger, and certainly very unusual. There are many others. 1 year later, on March 30th, 1966, a lady by the name of Donella Banning, a hairdresser, her mother and her employer were driving across the Wade Road overpass on Interstate 10 near Baytown, Texas, pictured here, when a glowing object dropped from the sky and struck the roof of their car. They didn't see how the object left, but afterward, an examination of the car revealed 2 5-inch wide dents, each spaced about 15 inches apart. So this wasn't apparently debris from another car, because this object took off and was never seen again. And what's really interesting is another case occurred 1 day later. On March 31st, 1966, 19-year-old Ray Lamarck was driving west on Q Street in Ralston, Nebraska, when an object appeared in front of him and struck his vehicle. As Lamarck says, and I quote, "It was a black-looking object with what looked like flames at the edges. I first saw it when it just about hit the car, coming in at a height of 6 feet. The object then struck the hood of his car, leaving a 3-foot wide dent on the hood and front fender. Again, this object was never identified." Now, one of the most interesting cases of all UFO car collisions occurred 1 year later, almost to the day, on March 28, 1967, to a factory worker by the name of David Morris. What makes this case so interesting is he did not crash into a UFO, but instead into apparent extraterrestrials, humanoid entities, who had appeared next to a landed UFO. Now, David Morris, he was 20 years old at the time. He was on his way home from his job at the Lamb Electric Company in Kent, Ohio. His home is located in Monroe Falls. This is just a short drive away. As he's driving home along the road, he says a thick fog settled over the area, causing him to drive slower than normal. It was around 2:20 a.m. when he noticed a weird orange glow ahead of him and to the left of the road. He thought that perhaps a house was on fire. However, as he crested the hill, he was amazed to see a, quote, wedge or cone-shaped object. He said it was about 12 feet wide, 25 feet tall, and was apparently landed in a field of wheat about 75 feet away from the road, or perhaps hovering maybe a few feet above the ground. He said it glowed with a bright orange light, and it almost looked transparent. A ball-shaped object appeared to rest on the apex of this object, this point, David felt no fear, but he was curious as to what this object might be. He estimates that he was traveling at about 30 miles per hour, and he's studying this object as he's driving by, trying to identify it. And movement ahead of him on the road caught his attention, and when he returned his gaze to the road, he was shocked to see 4 or 5 short figures standing in the road about 45 feet ahead of him. They were actually crossing the road. He estimates that they were about 3 or 4 feet tall, with large oversized heads and stocky bodies. Each of them were dressed in overalls, and they each glowed with this same eerie orange light. They were darting back and forth across the road with abnormal speed, David said, much faster than a person. And although his headlights illuminated them clearly, they did not seem to notice him and instead appeared to be very focused on moving back and forth across the road. So as soon as he sees them, he slammed on the brakes. Unfortunately, he was unable to stop in time, and he heard a thump as the right front of his car struck one of the figures. He skidded another 10 feet before coming to a stop. He says a metallic, brassy odor filled the air. But at any rate, David grabbed the door and was about to jump out and see if he could help. But he realized that whoever he had hit, they weren't human. Fear swept through him, and he thought to himself, if I killed them, they'll kill me. So instead of getting out of the car, he pressed down on the accelerator and fled the scene in fear. He looked into his rear-view mirror and saw one of the figures still standing in the road. Feeling cold and clammy, he raced home, sat in his living room, he says, for 2 hours, just thinking about what had happened and trying to calm down. He did call his friend, and the next day they returned to the scene. The only evidence they found were the skid marks from his vehicle. However, an inspection of his car revealed that the chrome trim was dented and scratched in 3 places. So fearing ridicule, David hesitated to call the police or report his encounter, but he did finally contact a reporter from a local newspaper. And when asked what he saw, David had no answer, only to say that it was, quote, unearthly, and that I've never had an experience like this. So this case was later investigated by UFO researchers who talked to David and verified this incident. However, David Morris was so unnerved by this experience that following this incident, he refused to take that route home from his job ever again, and he's started taking the longer back way along Route 5 to Marsh Road and south to Monroe Falls Road. A very interesting case. You can actually hear his first-hand testimony.
This was Tuesday morning. I just got off work at 2 o'clock. There had been a thunderstorm earlier that night, but it was over about an hour and a half earlier, and I was coming down North River Road. This was approximately 2:20 in the morning, and I started up over a big hill there on the road, and I saw this orange-red glow in the sky, something like a fire, and I thought maybe lightning had struck a house earlier that night, and the house was on fire. And I slowed down immediately, expecting to see fire trucks in this as I topped the hill. But as I topped the hill, I noticed off to the left-hand side of the road, and that would be the south side, an orangish-red object, which appeared to be a cone-shaped with a round sphere on top. It was about 25 feet tall and maybe 12 feet wide at the base, and appeared to be hovering over the ground maybe 2 feet at the most, if at all. This attracted my attention, and I was staring at it and driving at the same time. And just out of normal habit, I glanced back at the street. And as I glanced back at the street, I saw 4, maybe 5. There were 4 at least of these, what appeared to be people from this ship. They were running back and forth across the street, and I saw that they didn't recognize my presence there, the headlights or the noise from my car or anything, and they didn't stop running across in front of me, and I slammed on my brakes because I saw I would hit them. And as I slammed on my brakes, my car was skidding, and I heard this loud thump. And I maybe went 8 to 10 feet further after the impact with this object that I hit. I immediately, I started to get out of the car as just a first reaction when you hit something in the street. Then I thought that was all wrong to get out of the car, so I sped away down the street. And as I started away, I looked in the rearview mirror to catch a glance, and these objects had then stopped running back and forth across the street, and they were all standing there. I couldn't see whether they were standing over the one that I hit or not, but they had stopped running across the street. I got home, and I just kind of sat in the living room for a couple hours and thought of 1,000,001 different things that it could have been or what I could have done, and then I just went to bed.
Now, I noticed on your automobile that you have there's a space on your grill where it is sort of spread apart a wee bit, scratches, and then one thing I noticed, on the rim of your right headlight, it is dented too. Now, all of this occurred at this time. There was no dents there before because after seeing your car, I realized you keep it very well in good condition. Now, was this before, or were there any dents before to verify this?
There was only the one little crease there in the chrome piece. The rest of them were all made by this whatever I hit in the street.
And that on the rim of your headlight was made when you hit whatever you hit?
Yes, it was.
Now, we were wondering before we came out, and of course before we saw your automobile, I didn't realize it sat so high, and I thought perhaps it might be that the object you hit could have gone under the car. Would you explain why you don't feel this happened?
After I started down the street, I didn't feel any thump or anything underneath the car or like I'd ran over it with the tire. I either drove right over it or it went off to the side, one way or the other there. I couldn't say which it was.
Now, at this time, as you heard and felt the thump, in the light of your headlight, I think you said you could determine some part of the figure.
Yes, it was. I saw a part of an arm, maybe about 4 inches of the arm, and the hand, but there was no fingers on the hand, only a thumb.
In other words, you couldn't tell whether that could have been like a mitten or, like encased, a hand encased in a mitten, or you just don't know. It's just a quick flash. Is that right?
Yes, it was. I couldn't say whether it would be something that they had on their hand or their hand itself.
Could you describe, of course, I know all of this happened in like a flash, but would you describe to the best of your ability, Dave, the impression you had of these figures?
Yes, they were maybe 3.5 to 4 feet tall, built stockily, somewhat on the order of a midget, with the short legs and the longer arms than normal, and the heads were large. They were very large, out of proportion to the size body that they had. This could have been a head covering, but even if it would have been a head covering, they would have to make this covering so it fit the head. And at that, it would have had to have been bigger, and it wasn't a round head, more oblong, like a light bulb shape almost.
And there's so many. Another comes from 2 witnesses from Maumee, Ohio. This occurred on July 13, 1967, when Robert Richardson and his friend Jerry Quay, they were both 21 years old, were driving from Maumee, Ohio to White House. This case was investigated by the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization and was published in the APRO Bulletin. Now, the purpose of this road trip was to verify that the White House quarry would be open for swimming on that weekend, and these 2 young men were about halfway to their destination and coming around a corner in the road when they saw that the roadway ahead of them was completely blocked by a brilliant blue-white light. It was rectangular, they say, It was lying crosswise over the road and was about 22 feet long, they estimate, and 8 feet high. At the time, their car was moving at 40 miles per hour, and by the time they saw this object, it was too late to stop. Now, Robert Richardson did slam on the brakes, and as they actually struck the object, he closed his eyes to protect himself. They both felt a thump, and both were absolutely convinced they had physically struck this object, but when they opened their eyes, it was gone. Now, an inspection of their car did reveal that the bumper and hood were damaged, and in fact, the chrome plating of the bumper appeared to have been completely stripped off. Both men were so shook up that they drove directly to the nearest town of Waterville and called the police. The police returned with 2 officers to the scene of the accident, and other than the damage to the car, the only other evidence found were skid marks on the road and 2 small pieces of metal where the object had apparently struck the road. Now, APRO, of course, heard about this case. They dispatched one of their researchers, Niles H. Paquette, to investigate. And Paquette says he recovered the pieces of metal, which he sent to APRO for analysis. Unfortunately, the results of this analysis were not published as far as I know. And even more interesting was shortly after this event, Niles Paquette says he was approached by 2 apparent government officials, men in black, if you will, who questioned him about the physical evidence. Now, Paquette was unable to determine the identity of these men, and he was even more puzzled how they even knew about the case, which had not been publicized at all. There's a weird timing to some of these cases because it was only 3 days later that the 3rd UFO car collision of 1967 occurred in New York, more specifically in Millerton, New York. On July 17, 1967, a call came into the Millerton, New York police station regarding a stalled automobile on Route 22. Patrolman Lewis Lindsay was dispatched to the scene, and he found the car, and inside the car he found Mrs. Funk, stunned and confused, and she told the officer that she had been traveling north on Route 22 at around 11:25 p.m. when her car radio became filled with static, and at that moment a shiny, black, baseball-sized object swooped down out of the sky from above, collided into her windshield, and then appeared to bounce away. Now at the same time, her car headlights mysteriously went out, the car engine stalled, and Miss Funk lost consciousness. When she regained consciousness, she was dazed and disoriented, and her car, she said, was now facing in the opposite direction and was about 1 mile south of where the object had struck her car. So this appears to be more than a sighting or even a collision, but perhaps an onboard experience, given that there was all the electromagnetic effects. Her car was in a different location, and she blacked out, so I would say that there was probably missing time here. And in fact, Mrs. Funk's case found its way to a UFO organization called the Aerial Investigations and Research. It's now a defunct UFO investigative group that was headed by a gentleman by the name of William Donovan. But they recommended Miss Funk go under hypnotic regression, which she did. In fact, it was televised. And Miss Funk recalled that following the collision, aliens had approached her car, struck her on the chest with a strange rod. It wasn't entirely clear if she was actually taken on board the UFO. However, at some point she recalled her car being turned around, and this, again, was filmed and later televised during a news special on UFOs. Probably the best known UFO collision case of all times occurred at around 1:40 a.m. on August 24, 1979, to a deputy sheriff by the name of Val Johnson. On that evening, Val was on a routine patrol outside of Stephen, Minnesota, and looking ahead of him on the road, he observed a, quote, bright, brilliant light heading toward him at very low elevation. And as Val Johnson says, and I quote, "The edges were very defined. I thought perhaps at first that it could be an aircraft in trouble, as it appeared to be a landing light from an aircraft." He continued driving, but suddenly at the same time, this light zoomed directly towards him, and before he had a chance to even evade this object, it swooped down and struck his car in an apparent head-on collision. And as Val Johnson says, the inside of the car lit up. I remember that. It was a very dazzling appearance. He immediately lost consciousness and woke up about 40 minutes later to an incredible scene. His car, which had been heading south, was now sideways in the road facing east, as is pictured here. And in fact, his windshield was shattered, though it was still intact. You can see the damage to the windshield. One of the vehicle's headlights was broken. There was a large dent on the hood of the car. And as you can see, the car antenna also was bent backwards. And as Val Johnson says in his own words, something did strike my vehicle. Something didn't want me there, apparently. Or I can't put judgment on it. I really don't know how to classify it. I can't classify it as an attack. Perhaps it was a mistake. He said this after the incident, but immediately following this, when he woke up, he radioed for assistance, and an officer asked, "What is your condition?" And Val Johnson replied, "I don't know. Something just hit my car. I don't know how to explain it. Strange." The other officer asked, "What's your condition? Are you okay?" He was still disoriented. He said, "Something attacked my car." So another officer was immediately dispatched, and following the collision, Val Johnson exited his car and saw that his tires had left skid marks along the road, which were later measured at 19.9 feet in length. So presumably he had slammed on the car brakes, though he has no memory of this. And he also saw that one of the red siren lights on his cruiser was broken. So he was quite shaken up, but appeared at first to be uninjured. But he quickly realized, however, that he was mistaken. And by the time another officer arrived, Val Johnson realized he was suffering from, quote, very sore eyes. He was immediately transported to Warren Hospital, where a doctor diagnosed him with a, quote, mild case of welder's burn to my eyes. I found that interesting because that does turn up in a number of UFO cases. Val Johnson was treated with lotion and bandages on his eyes, and after further examination, he returned home. However, as he says, my eyes were extremely painful. Now, he later discovered that his watch and the police clock both registered 14 minutes short of the actual time. This case caused a huge sensation in the UFO community. It was one thing to have a police officer going on record about what he had seen. I mean, this had happened many times. However, in Val Johnson's case, his story was supported by physical evidence, not only in the form of his injuries, but the damage to the vehicle itself. Val Johnson's automobile, a 1977 Ford LTB, was eventually examined by several UFO researchers, as well as experts from Ford Motors and engineers from Honeywell, in an attempt to explain what had caused the damage. And not surprisingly, the researchers were unable to produce any conventional explanations. Val Johnson's employer, Officer Dennis Breck, said, and I quote, We do believe our deputy had an encounter we haven't been able to explain. I don't know what happened." And Officer Dennis Breck said in a later interview that he did, in fact, believe in UFOs. The case really got some publicity and was investigated after Val Johnson contacted UFO investigator Alan Hendry, who began an investigation and eventually brought the case to the forefront of research. Later, Val Johnson's case was featured on the television program That's Incredible. And on the show, 6 months after the encounter, Val Johnson said that this incident was his one and only encounter, and that it, quote, brought us closer together as a family unit. Other than this show, Val Johnson has shunned any publicity, and no further information about this incident has been forthcoming. An equally dramatic incident involving a UFO vehicle collision occurred to 2 Walmart employees in 1984 in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Now, these witnesses are anonymous. The main witness, I'll call Conrad, that is a pseudonym, and he wrote to the National UFO Reporting Center, "I do not wish to reveal my identity at this time. My story is a very strange one, and I have not told many people about this. We decided to keep quiet about this incident back then because of being fired, or people thinking that we were responsible in some way, as will be explained. They may have thought we were seeing things or drinking, but we were doing neither." So this was a warm day, and the weather was clear and beautiful. Conrad and his co-worker were driving a U-Haul rental truck, as they had done many times before, transporting merchandise from the warehouse to the main Walmart store. Now, this was a 7-mile drive. This was a fairly large truck, so Conrad was driving very carefully. And as he says, everything was going well until we came to the 4-way intersection on the Nashville Road from Campbell Lane, as is pictured here. This is the exact intersection. And as Conrad says, "I stopped at the intersection's red light and proceeded to turn right onto Nashville Road. We pulled up a bit and proceeded to drive the short distance left to our destination when something really powerful and large hit our U-Haul. Whatever it was hit us so hard, it literally made us jerk sideways, and it made a loud metal crashing noise. After gathering our senses, I put on the flashing emergency red lights, and we got out to see what happened. We both thought that somebody had hit us in the back end of our truck, yet when we looked around, there was not any vehicle anywhere that had hit us. Nothing. We would have seen a vehicle pass us while we were inside the truck, but this was not the case either. So there was no other traffic on the road at the time, so there were no other witnesses. The 2 men got out of the U-Haul. Nothing was visible around them that could have struck them. That's when they looked at the truck and got a huge shock. As Conrad says, "Now confused and puzzled, we decided to look for damage to the U-Haul, and this is where the real strangeness comes to play. When we went to the right passenger side of the truck, there was some severe damage to the truck, but it was near the very top side of the vehicle. My coworker and I were completely stunned and speechless. A severe dent, about 8 feet long and 2 feet deep, was plainly visible on the truck near the top. This was the passenger side that no traffic at all could have been near because there was no road there, just a schoolyard. Whatever had hit the upper part of the U-Haul had to have been airborne. The damage to the truck was extensive, highly visible, and not there when we had begun our trip that afternoon. The truck was checked before we left the store. Whatever hit the truck had to have been airborne, and very big and slanted to make a deep dent like that. The damage looked like what a disc would make if it hit metal." So the men had no choice but to return to their vehicle and continue their interrupted journey. As Conrad says, "We didn't know what to do. and feared that we would be held liable for the damage. We feared for our jobs too. After all, who would possibly believe such a story as this? How could we logically explain this? After a while of talking, we both decided to keep quiet about this because we felt we had to. Nothing was ever mentioned to us about the damaged U-Haul either when we got back to our store, and we felt that was odd too. So it was 22 years after this incident that Conrad finally decided to report it to the National UFO Reporting Center. And as he writes in his report, and I quote, "Something airborne hit and damaged our U-Haul. As far as seeing a UFO or such, we didn't. Yet my coworker and I did encounter something very strange and unexplainable indeed. This is a true story, and my previous coworker can verify my story if he ever decided to come forward. I still to this day cannot understand what happened to us that day back in 1984, but I can tell you absolutely that something very large, airborne, and powerful struck our U-Haul truck that day. Whatever it was had to have been flying at treetop level and grazed our truck. Yet we never saw the craft or whatever it was. This story is absolutely true and accurate. I have no idea how to give you any kind of sensible explanation for this. We were attacked or hit by something strange. Strange stuff." So, yeah, UFO car collisions are bizarre enough, but even more strange and rare are cases involving people who have struck entities. And one such case occurred on September 1st, 1984, to a family driving along Highway 89, not too far from Coyame, Arizona. It was around 2 a.m. They were driving south on Highway 89, moving at about 60 miles per hour, and the father who was driving describes what happened next in his own words. As he says, "A person dressed in total white appeared in the middle of the road 40 feet in front of us. We skidded to a stop, but not in time to avoid hitting the person. They heard no sound of any impact as they struck this figure, and the figure disappeared. The father exited the car and searched the vehicle and the area around it. Nothing was there. This was a bright moonlit night. There was no way for the figure to just disappear. This was largely a desert area. But unable to solve the mystery, he got back into his car and continued driving. And more strange things began to happen. As the witness says, a half-mile later, the engine dies and the headlights fail. The interior lights, the brake lights, emergency flashers, radio are all dead. He grabbed a flashlight and used a VOM, a voltage meter, to check the voltage in the battery. It registered 0 volts, so he quickly escorted his family out of the car and off the highway where they would be safer. And as he returned to the car to get some blankets, the interior lights of the car spontaneously switched back on. So he was quite surprised by this. He checked the car battery again, which now measured 12 volts. So they all got back in the car and continued on their way and returned home without incident. The witness, who was knowledgeable about car engines, examined the vehicle, and as he says, "I checked the battery, cables, generator, other wiring, and found nothing unusual. I considered a main fuse breaking, then in some way shorting itself to regain electrical power, but the fuses showed nothing, no burn marks, etc." So 20 years following this incident, he decided to report it to the Mutual UFO Network. Now I just got a few more cases I'd like to present to you of UFO car collisions, but I think they're important, so I want to get through all of them. And the next case I'd like to talk about occurred on November 21st, 1988 at around 11 a.m. in the deserts of New Mexico. The exact location is not described, but the main witness is Eric Eversole, who was driving with his friend Tammy Lockhart through the New Mexico desert. Ahead of him in another car was his friend Steve. So they were convoying through the desert. Off in the distance to his left, Eric noticed a shiny object traveling in the same direction as they were, kind of pacing their car. At first he assumed this was another car, but it was strange because this was a very isolated area and there weren't any roads where he saw this object. And he described it as being a round ball of metal hovering about 2 or 3 feet above the ground. He kept his eye on it and saw that it was traveling at a diagonal path, which was quickly approaching his car on an apparent collision course. So he had a walkie-talkie, and he quickly grabbed it and told his friend Steve ahead of him on the road to take a look. And Steve responded that he saw it. He saw, quote, something shiny. And he began talking to Eric's friend Tammy. Now Eric told Tammy to look, but she was too busy on the walkie-talkie talking to Steve, and she wasn't paying attention. Eric, however, was becoming quickly convinced that something very unusual was happening. And he says, I kept driving and looking, and the round ball, the size of a basketball, got closer to my car. And as it got close, he could see it quite clearly. Again, it was pacing his car, getting closer and closer, and he kept his eye on it as best as he could while driving. He had the distinct feeling that this object knew he was looking at it. As Eric says, I kept driving. The round metal orb seemed to be coming toward my car, straight toward my passenger door on my left. All of a sudden, it was about 5 feet from my car. I saw it really clear. I knew I saw it. I felt it in my mind. I yelled to Tammy to look real quick on my left, but by the time she looked, it hit my car between my door and the passenger door. I stopped the car real fast, then I looked down real quick. The orb stopped for a second, then went around my car, and when I looked in my rear view mirror, I saw it hover over the road back through the other side of the desert and vanish. So he pulled over and stopped, as did his friend Steve. And as Eric says, there was a round dent in the side of my car. His friend Tammy was a bit shaken up. She thought at first that they had hit a rock. Steve, however, in the car ahead, said that he saw it. He saw, quote, something round hit the car. But he said it happened so fast he didn't get a very good look. But Eric was awestruck. He knew that whatever had hit them was not a rock. It was very unusual. As he says, I saw it very clearly. I know what I saw. It has been bugging me for years. Whoever built that metal orb wanted me to see it. And in the days, months, and years, actually, following this incident, Eric continued to be haunted by this encounter. He says he sometimes feels like he is still being watched. He also has a very strong feeling that a day is coming when UFOs will show themselves to the public at large, and everyone on this planet will know that UFOs are real. Again, a very interesting case. And here's another case, more recent, involving a collision with an actual entity. This is quite an interesting case. The main witness in this case is anonymous. I call him Drake. And this occurred on January 17, 1989, along Lucky Strike Road at the Spring Mountain Youth Camp. This is in Mount Charleston, which is outside of Las Vegas, Nevada. Drake was in a Chevy Suburban heading up Lucky Strike Road, and his superior, Joe, was driving. Drake was in the front passenger seat, and behind both of them sat another boy by the name of Todd. Now I will say that both of these witnesses, Drake and Todd, were young men, and they were being held at the camp as a result of delinquent behavior, and they were there to be rehabilitated. So this is a youth camp for troubled youngsters. And Drake reported what happened to the Mutual UFO Network. And it's quite a dramatic incident. As Drake writes, "At the time, this was a partial dirt road. We came around one of the last curves to the left, and a being stepped out of the forest and into the road. Joe didn't see the being and struck the being at the last minute and dragged the being halfway down the road. Then the Suburban went over the side of the mountain. Luckily, the Suburban came to a halt, slamming into a tree." So this caused a pretty severe accident. Thankfully, they weren't hurt. The Coach Joe, made sure the boys were all right, told them to stay there, and hiked up the road and went to get help. But as Drake climbed out of the car, he said he saw what appeared to be the severed foot of the strange creature that he had seen them strike. And this was not a normal foot. As Drake says, "It was nothing I have ever seen before. It had 3 toes with sharp talons, black as nails." Now, Todd did not see this being either. It was just Drake, and he asked Drake what happened. And Drake pointed to this strange severed foot and told Todd, "We must have hit whatever this foot belonged to." Now, at this point, they did hear something moving around in the brush alongside the road. So they both picked up a couple of sticks, followed this noise, and came upon an incredible sight. As Drake says, "We found a being lying on its stomach, attempting to crawl away. It had the similarity of a crocodile, the way the back looked and tail. It heard me behind it, and it flipped over on its back." And at this point, Drake became even more shocked because this was a reptilian-like creature covered entirely in scales. It was clearly female. He could tell by its body. This creature had arms and legs like a human, but otherwise looked very much reptilian. He estimates it was about 7 or 8 feet tall. And as Drake says, "When it realized I was there, it crawled quickly towards the nearest tree and used the tree to support itself, to stand on one leg with its back against the tree. This being looked at me and Todd and began to cry with a voice like a child crying for help." So Drake and Todd realized at this point that this figure was not threatening. They put their sticks down and approached the being, and it began speaking to them in a loud voice. And according to Drake, he and the being actually conversed, asking questions of each other, which he did not elaborate on. But finally, another car drove up. It was driven by a teacher from the youth camp. Drake and Todd stopped the vehicle and asked the teacher to drive this being to the hospital. The teacher refused, but said he would go get help. So they stayed with the being until night fell, at which point Coach Joe returned, and he insisted that the boys return to the youth camp. Drake wanted to stay with the being, but the coach would not allow it and promised that he would send help in the morning. So reluctantly, Drake and his friend Todd left the scene, returned to the youth camp, and the next morning, Drake was called into the office to meet with a man wearing a black suit and hat, some sort of government agent, Drake believes. And this man wanted to know what happened. And as Drake says, "As I told the story and got to the part describing this being, this person in black interrupted me and said, 'It was a deer.' Drake said, 'Excuse me, I was there and it was no deer.' And he described this reptilian being again, but the man interrupted him and said very forcefully, 'It was a deer.' And he began to threaten Drake, reminding him that he was already in custody and that they had the authority to keep him there until he was 26 years old. So Drake was furious, understandably, but he was smart enough to see what was happening, and he had no choice but to lie. So he told the man, okay, it was a deer. And he was eventually released from this camp. But this really affected him profoundly, and 22 years later, following this incident, he reported his case to MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, saying, quote, "I must talk with someone." As far as I know, this case was never followed up on. I do find it interesting in that it involves a reptilian. There's no apparent UFO. This is true with other reptilian cases I know of. They're often seen out in the wilderness. So yeah, a very interesting case. And I just have 3 more UFO car collision cases I'd like to present to you. These next ones are quite brief. This next one occurred sometime in the early 2000s. The exact date is not given, nor is the location. The witnesses themselves are anonymous. The only information that regarding the location is that a boy and his girlfriend were returning from the Olive Garden restaurant. They had just descended the hill and were passing a house in a suburb and were almost to their home when a small object appeared right next to their car on the passenger side. And as the main witness says, "We spotted it simultaneously but did not know what it was. It was black, cubic, and about 2 feet on each side." His girlfriend said she could see 4 metallic legs under it. But the main witness said, "I thought I could see heat radiation coming off of its surface. I tried to avoid it, but it lifted up and rammed my right front fender, hard as I passed, knocking off my fog light and folding the fender under the wheel well. The object had a metallic feel to it when it hit my car." So he was freaked out, but he kept driving. The whole car itself began to vibrate roughly like it was about to stall. His girlfriend said, "I hear something weird." She rolled down the window. At this point, as the witness says, "We both heard loud jet engine-like noises coming from the right side of the car. I told her to roll up the window and that I would try to get us home. The object was pushing laterally on my car. Suddenly the noise and force pushing against the car stopped. I coasted in my driveway. We got out and examined the car, and the right side of the fender shroud had been split. Plastic parts littered my driveway, including the fog light." By this point, the object they had struck was now gone. Another real brief case occurred to an anonymous woman driving near Mount Clemens, Michigan. This was on November 27, 1998, when the anonymous witness saw what she described as a highly intense ball of white light about the size of a basketball heading towards her car. She was unable to avoid it, and this object struck her car, causing an audible thump. It then moved off, and afterwards she inspected her car and found a narrow streak of cream gray colored residue where the vehicle had been struck. She contacted researchers, and they actually gathered a sample of this residue, which was sent to UFO researcher Phyllis Buttinger for analysis. And the results were quite interesting. They showed that this substance appeared to be magnesium oxide. Interestingly, this metallic element has been detected in UFO metal fragment cases. This element is stable at high temperatures and has high thermal conductivity and low electrical conductivity. So commercially, it's often used for fireproofing. In other words, UFO occupants may find it an optimum material for the outside skin of their craft. And one final UFO car collision case, quite recent, occurred on May 2004 to an anonymous woman who was driving along Lake Cook Road in Algonquin, Illinois. She was driving at 40 miles per hour. There were no other cars on the road when, without warning, her car suddenly lurched to the right for no apparent reason. She stopped the car to investigate and was shocked to see that the entire left side of her car was completely crumpled in. There was no damage to the paint at all. It was as if she had struck some sort of weird force field. It almost looked like her car had been melted. The case was eventually sent to MUFON for investigation, and although there was no evidence that an actual UFO had caused the damage, researchers were also unable to explain how it had occurred. Pretty amazing, huh? I mean, I really did not expect to find that many cases, and I certainly wonder about these cases in which people have hit actual extraterrestrials. Pretty darn interesting, and again, super rare. So many people report being chased down the road by these objects, sometimes lifted up into the sky, as I did on another episode. I mean, there are lots and lots of UFO car encounters. So this category involving actual collisions is exceedingly rare. But as we can see, it does happen. And in fact, it happens with other vehicles like trains. Once again, I only found one case involving a train. This is pretty well known in the UFO community. You may have heard of it before, but this occurred in Shelbyana, Kansas, and it's quite an interesting case. This case occurred on January 14, 2002, and again is, as far as I know, the only case involving a train that has struck a UFO. This train was reportedly en route from Russell, Kansas to Shelbyana, Kansas. It was 2:47 a.m., January 14, 2002, when the main witness, Derek, that's a pseudonym, and the conductor were at milepost 42, coming around an area which they nicknamed the Wild Kingdom due to the fact that there were many animals seen there. Then they noticed this bright light ahead of them on the tracks. They instantly assumed this was another train, which was not unusual. So as Derek says, I killed our lights as not to blind the oncoming crew. As we rounded the corner, our onboard computer began to flash in and out. The speed recorder went nuts, and both locomotives died. Alarm bells began to ring, and that's when we saw the objects. There were 3 of them, each metallic silver, with multiple colored lights near the bottom and around the middle. He discerned no portholes or markings, but these were classic discs, each about 10 feet high, maybe 20 feet wide. They were situated at various positions over the nearby river, sending down what looked like searchlights. However, the first and closest object was only 10, maybe 12 feet above the train tracks, dead ahead. And as the main witness Derek says, and I quote, with both engines dead, as we rounded the corner, we made little noise. And the first object did not respond in time. I estimate that we hit the object at 30 miles per hour with 16,000 trailing tons behind us. It clipped the top of our lead unit, then skipped back, slicing a chunk out of our trailing unit and the first 2 coal cars. The other 2 objects vanished into thin air. So due to the loss of power, the emergency brakes had been automatically engaged. However, even with the brakes, the train didn't come to a stop until almost 2 miles down the track. By this time, the power had come back on. Derek and the conductor called their dispatcher in Jacksonville, Florida, and reported the incident. They were told to inspect the cars and ensure that they would, quote, hold the rail, and then to travel to milepost 60. And as Derek says, we checked everything out, and the cab of the rear locomotive was demolished and smoking. The second 2 cars looked as if they had been hit with a giant hammer, but they looked like they'd hold the rail. So Derek and the rest of the crew limped back into Paintsville, where they were confronted by an incredible scene. And I'll just quote the main witness directly, as he says, we pulled into the Paintsville yard at approximately 5:15 a.m. The huge overhead lights lining the yard were noticeably dark, and the only lights came from what we assumed were railroad officials' vehicles parked near the end of the track. We pulled to a stop and began unloading our grips off the wounded train. We could hear what sounded like an army of workers immediately tending to our train. Vehicle doors slamming, guys running by in weird outfits, and lights glaring from all directions. The one thing missing was railroad officials. At this point, Derek was approached by a man who introduced himself as Mr. Ferguson, took him into an office where there were unidentified government officials waiting. So once again, we see these men in black type. Both Derek and his conductor were asked hundreds of questions. Derek repeatedly asked to speak with the road foreman or the train master. These requests were denied. Instead, they confiscated the conductor's cell phone and told both men that they could leave, but only after they had been medically tested for their own protection. After all this, Derek went outside and saw that the damaged train cars had been disconnected from the rest of the locomotive and were now parked under a quickly constructed, huge tent-like structure which was buzzing with activity. And as Derek was led away from the scene, he was told, quote, "Due to national security, your silence on this matter would be appreciated." Now their adventure wasn't over yet. They were then taken to Martin, Kentucky, where they were again questioned, this time by railroad officials, and they were then also drug tested. Finally, they were taken to their original destination, Shelbyana, where they slept for 8 hours, and then were assigned to work a train returning along the exact same route in reverse, from Shelbyana back to Russell, Kansas. And as Derek says, and I quote, "Working back, we passed by Paintsville. No sign of the engines, cars, tent, people, nothing." So the entire incident was allegedly covered up. Officially, the explanation given was damage due to a rock slide. Now, there have been accusations of a hoax on this case, but nobody has been able to provide evidence of it. And in fact, there are additional reports of strange activity in the area at that time of the incident. As reported to the National UFO Reporting Center, a Paintsville firefighter and a paramedic, good witnesses, were driving home in Paintsville on the evening in question when he saw a big light zigzag over the road in front of me. That's a direct quote. He said the light was about 250 feet overhead and was followed by 2 other lights. So that's 3 objects, which matches what the main witness, Derek, says. And according to this witness, as the objects passed overhead, his headlights flickered, and the gauges on the dashboard, quote, "went crazy." He was very much impressed. He called 911 and later heard about this train collision, reported his sighting to the National UFO Reporting Center. So while this is a very controversial case and has not been, as far as I know, officially investigated, it appears to be legitimate. Now, I did find a couple of cases involving UFOs that collided with boats. I found only one that I thought was really worth presenting. So that's the case I'm going to be talking about here. It's quite brief, but it's pretty well verified and I think very interesting. On February 5, 1964, 11 survivors were rescued by the Coast Guard from their emergency raft following the sinking of their yacht, the Hattie D, off the coast of Mendocino, California. Now, this is an area of particularly high UFO and USO activity, but what makes this story so unusual is that all 11 survivors of the Hattie D insisted that they were sunk by an unidentified undersea object. The boat had set sail originally from Seattle, Washington, and was making its way down the coast of California when tragedy struck. Without any warning, the yacht either struck or was rammed by an unidentified, quote, metal object. The boat sank shortly later without any evidence of what had actually struck their boat. Crewman Carl Jansen elaborated on the event, saying, and I quote, "I don't care how deep it was. What held us was steel and a long piece. There was no give to it at all." So while they didn't see what it was, UFO investigators seized upon this as a possible USO incident, and whatever sunk the Hattie D remains unidentified. So there you go. Those are all the cases I could locate in the UFO literature involving collisions with unidentified flying objects and or extraterrestrials. And yeah, there are quite a few of them. I did present these cases in my book, Not From Here, Volume 4. These volumes are, of course, all about the more unusual cases, the outline cases, the cases that haven't gotten a lot of attention. So if you want to learn more about these UFO collisions, you can certainly check that out. And that is it for today. I hope you've learned something new about UFOs and extraterrestrial presence on our planet. I hope you found this episode interesting. Once again, I want to thank you very much for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep searching for answers. Keep looking for the truth. And most important, keep having fun.